Vanessa.
Hi, Dom. So ready to go. My goodness, raring with vim.
The hour is late. The glass of wine is half empty.
What does this mean? You want to return to it swiftly?
I
mean, not that it's ever us recording an intro has ever stopped you before
from nursing my wine.
Yes.
No, it never has. I'm saying that I don't have much to keep me here. So
it can all fall apart quickly. Things do fall apart.
Today we have, I hope I pronounce his name correctly, Jacob Mchangama, who recently released his book, Free Speech. Catchy title.
Free Speech, A History from Socrates to Social Media is the book title. Run to your bookstores.
Actually, you should run to your bookstores because aside from being...
helping them stay alive?
No, aside from the book being written just addictively, it's that type of review that our current moment really deserves. He had it on his own podcast, but I really recommend just reading it because he takes this idea of free speech, which underpins so much of our discussions here in Uncertain Things and generally in the podcast sphere and the whatever we are, political nomads, but takes it through all the steps of, I guess, Western history, specifically through the lens of legal impact. How did the legal theories around free speech evolve into what we have today? So for people who listen to this podcast, who I assume are the Venn diagram overlap of political depressionados and history nerds, that book is for you. You should probably read it. You'll have fun. I had so much fun. And in fact,
we did not get to everything we wanted to talk about.
In fact, I had way too much fun, and I do need to apologize because usually I'm a stellar podcast host, but I just received some bad personal news before the interview, and I was a little out of sorts, and I think I completely missed several marks that I wanted to get to. First of all, and this is the thing that I need to apologize the most, I think we ended up cutting that piece of embarrassment, but I do need to come clean. I have, on record, confused, mistook the Peace of Augsburg with the Treaty of Westphalia, which is a shameful thing. They're separated by 100 years. They're part of the same Germanic movement towards statehood and the birth of the nation state. So there's connection there, but Augsburg was one thing. It gave principalities the autonomy to establish their own version of Christianity, while the Treaty of Westphalia is famously the early draft of European nation states. So that was already a bad sign that I was not on my A game.
But I mean, the upside of you potentially not being on your A game is that if you are in the history nerd circle of this Venn diagram more than the political side, there's lots for you to chew on.
Yes, I wanted to start the conversation with the more historical journey because it is such a fascinating question how this thing that we just take for granted today about being able to spew all the shit that we contain inside, all of the angst and bad takes that have roosted in our minds, and we can just put them out there. We just take it so much for granted, and how just out of touch, not just with human history, that is, but with human nature. The idea that we should be able to do this without some official in uniform coming and dragging us to prison for the nasty, dirty thoughts that we have just expressed. So how we ended up defying that part of our nature to a point where it's not just codified in law, but also accepted culturally, broadly, as something worth protecting, at least by some, is a fascinating, non-trivial journey. And that's what Jacob captures in, I'd say, the first 2/3 of his book. Just that intellectual, legal, political journey of the West, from being part of normal human society to being this perverse culture where we sanctify the stupid things that people think. Obviously, I'm saying that facetiously because that's amazing. All that was to say that my big mistake was that I got so immersed in the historical travails that I completely lost track of time. So when we finally got to current events, there were many questions that I didn't get to ask. We did talk a lot about current events, though. We did talk about how, paradoxically, it seems like we are at a zenith of free expression, but at the same time, there's a recession. But we didn't go into as much details as I would have liked. We didn't talk about Joe Rogan or the recent op-ed at the New York Times about self-censorship. So I apologize, and I will compensate you, dear listener. I have a specific guest in mind to expand these topics with, but I'm not going to jinx it. So wait and see, or wait and hear. But luckily, Jacob is amazing. So
Yeah.
everything that he says is fascinating. It constantly connects the historical to our current moment, but definitely to be continued.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned Jakob's podcast, which we also recommend, which is A Clear and Present Danger. So if you are not into reading and you're more into listening, you'll get a lot of the content that's in the book in that podcast, which is also really, really great to check out as well.
Before we actually go into the conversation, there are just 2 points that we should address. One of them is a piece of the conversation that was important for me to get to, and we didn't, was, although we were building towards it a little bit, was this question of self-censorship. We talk in with Jacob about free speech as a matter of law, as something that either your government or your neighbors police you, whether it's by state or by culture. But the idea that at some point you can absorb censorious tendencies and internalize them to the point where you just don't dare to make certain utterances in the first place is something that kind of eludes that distinction, because you can have the strongest protections of free speech and you can have the, officially the strongest sense that nobody is going to rat you out in your neighborhood, and still have some inhibition in the back of your mind as a product of a subcurrent that you think that you're going to end up being blamed for saying the wrong things, whether it's on Twitter or family dinners, or that you just attribute certain cultural stigma to certain ideas, making you scared of associating yourself with them. But the result is that you start lying or start falsifying your own beliefs. And the result is whatever the opposite of freedom is, and is grotesque.
I mean, we talked a little bit about that with Mark Lila when he was discussing the need to cultivate your own individual garden of kind of intellectual delight, I guess, that doesn't need to kowtow to whatever you're supposed to read or think or enjoy. And I think he was proposing a kind of God, for lack of a better term, safe space in your own life in order to kind of escape the. I think he was suggesting them kind of more censorious attitudes of society today, where it is a bit more difficult to admit what it is you're thinking or pondering or enjoying at any one moment or other.
I think you're presenting Mark Lila's ideas accurately. The
Mm,
question is this sufficient
right.
for free
Is that
speech?
enough to create a protection, I guess? Can you live in that walled garden, or is
Right,
the waves of self-censorship gonna come in anyway?
right. And no, but I mean, the question of whether you can end up changing your own mind internally, that's one of the premises of 1984, right? Controlling the language and refining the technology of policing and punishment to the point where people can't even think seditiously, not even in their own garden or diary, as is the case with Winston Smith. But even if we are still, I'm not convinced that that's truly a reality. But what is a reality is that people have bad ideas internally and are afraid to express them, have quote unquote bad ideas, have ideas that societies sees as morally tainted. And as with everything that is morally tainted, society puts a cost, a social cost, on having these ideas. And while on one hand it makes perfect sense that society should clearly circumscribe certain ideas as beyond the pale, like we no longer consider slavery as part of our conversation. But at the same time, we should be worried about creating a society in which people are afraid to speak honestly, because the people who are afraid to speak out their awful ideas aren't really having their minds changed. If anything, they cling more strongly to the things that they can't speak openly.
Is that what you call the Streisand effect?
No, the Streisand effect is drawing attention to something by forcing people not to talk about this. When you ban a book, you suddenly introduce it to people who may have never heard of it before and make them want to read it.
Right. So it's kind of like that, but on an individual
It's
level,
worse.
kinda.
No, it's worse than that, I would say, because when you are telling people not to talk about a certain idea and you don't give them the space to have them publicly debated, you're basically sending the people who have those bad ideas to go out and seek like-minded outcasts. And then rather than being challenged and coming to contact with opposition and conflict, those ideas get tunneled into the silo of panderers. And the ideas aren't likely to get cultivated or made more nuanced under those conditions. They will become more radical and dumb, because when you don't meet people who disagree with you, your opinions become worse. They become more shallow. They become boring. That's the whole fucking point. But even beyond that objection, what value is there in something like free speech if in a supposed free society, if you're not allowed to have your dumb ideas heard in a forum? It sounds so absurd to me that the people who proclaim to be defenders of democracy or of liberal values or whatever would just so easily brush off one of the absolutely fundamental things that both define and justify democracy.
I mean, it's not new. As Jacob points out, there's been a lot of supposed proponents of free speech who backtrack mighty quickly as soon as the speech touches on something that they don't want to be discussed,
right?
Or they don't agree with, or that it makes them look bad. Like the free, even the strongest free speech advocate has limits, at least as history shows us. There are few kind of radical martyrs in the free speech world.
Yeah, because as I said at the beginning, it's not just historically abnormal for us to like free speech. It's just It's just an outside of human nature.
Right.
We don't want to hear things that make us unhappy, uncomfortable, or threatened. That's just our nature.
Right. Which is why we need to bolster and protect it. Which is and not just free speech, right? I mean, does this take us to our second housekeeping item, Adaam?
Yes.
Because it's not just free speech that's at risk at this moment. It's also democracy itself. And part of the reason why we wanted to talk to Jacob is because we are kind of going forth on a little series here where we're going to be talking to people about the topic of democracy and why it's at risk and why we need to preserve it.
So for the next couple of weeks, us and a bunch of other podcasters have joined with a group called Represent Us,
which is a nonpartisan organization. And the idea is that, in banding together, we will spread the word about, protecting things like elections and all those good things that we like and require for a functioning liberal society.
Obviously, this is a theme that we care about globally, internationally, but Represent Us is focused on what's going on here. Following the election, we've seen more and more people that seem to be on a quest to curtail the suite of rights associated with liberal democracy. And it's frustrating because it's something that we talked about with your spouse a few months ago with Zev. This is not new from the earliest days of American democracy. We've seen versions of gerrymandering and attempts to create voting restrictions. Obviously, there
Right.
were voting restrictions in place when the Constitution was signed. Like free speech, democracy is one of those things that people really don't want the other team to have.
And I think this is one of the themes that we've been talking about from the very start of this podcast, because this is one of those things that I had not examined really, like why liberal democracy matters. And in our very first interview with Tomer Persico, I asked him to just define liberal democracy and explain to me why it is precious, because this is something that you had kind of come in as like baseline assumption, we need it, and I wanted to having never really thought about it that much, I wanted to unpack it and understand why. And I think throughout the course of the podcast, I've been kind of asking different people this question again and again, and what I'm starting to understand is that the all of the things that we kind of take for granted in our society today are things that are really only afforded us by liberal democracy. Things like free speech, for example, things kind of like it, values that we hold dear in society. And like you said, like these are not things that were easily won. These are not things that are easily held together. These are things that are fragile and are vulnerable and unfortunately are not seen as such. And so they keep getting battered, uh, attacked, taken down by different means and by different sides in different ways. And so it's one of those things that you actually do have to think about preserving, bolstering, and taking stands,
Buttressing.
buttressing, word of the pod, um, and kind of taking a stand to protect, because it is by maintaining a liberal democracy that we are able to enjoy the freedoms and the diversity and the inclusion and all the things that we all the things we little liberals say that we want in
It-
society.
oh
So
my God. It sounds like I successfully brainwashed you, Vanessa. It's almost
yeah,
scary.
it is scary, isn't it? It is a
Yeah,
little scary.
I think you should snap out of it. So, precisely for the reason I mentioned earlier, I do not want to get complacent in my shallow liberalism.
I mean, I
Thank God I still have tanks like Batya to argue with. I name checked her 2 episodes in a row, so I just had to complete this trio.
I mean, I think you have definitely like dragged me a little bit from my positions, but I don't think I'm all the way over. So there's still more to drag. There's still more to go.
One hopes.
One hopes.
So what's really fun is that we can have this meandering conversation as an appetizer for an even longer meandering conversation. That's
Yeah.
such a great concept. Who came up with it?
Oh man, it's very on brand, I guess.
And I hope you don't resent us this conversation, and I hope you don't resent it so much so that you actually wish to show us your support and give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, because that makes us happy, and of course allows us to reach more people.
Yes, and we didn't mention, but if you are interested in this democracy, the other podcasts who are doing democracy themed content and kind of in supporting the cause, you just can go to represent.us/podcast and you can learn more about that.
Yes, you can do that. I think I ranted out everything I needed to, and with that hopefully not too self-deprecating note,
Jacob Mchangama. Is it Jacob or
Jacob.
Whatever you prefer.
That's the worst. I have OCD. I can't make arbitrary choices. But Jakob/Jacob, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, my pleasure. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
As I said, I wrote to you just as I was finishing your book, which I love for several reasons. Obviously, the topic of free speech is
near and dear to Adaam's heart.
Right, and it's like very, very of the moment for a lot of people. But the perspective that you took to it is the angle of a legal scholar, which is even closer to my heart. Can you give us a quick elevator bio in terms of how you're coming into this topic?
So I was born and raised in cozy secular liberal Denmark, and And I think for much of the 90s and sort of the early 2000s, I, like many other in the West, but maybe especially in my part of the world, took free speech for granted. It was like breathing the air. And then Denmark suddenly became sort of the epicenter of a global battle of values between free speech and religion, as a Danish newspaper published a number of cartoons depicting the Muslim prophet Muhammad, which set off sort of a huge debate and a violent one. So one of the editors, who later became my friend, still lives with 24 hours security. Lots of terrorist attacks have been foiled. And one of the reasons why the French magazine Charlie Hebdo was murderously attacked by jihadists was because they were one of the few magazines that showed solidarity and republished these cartoons. So this debate arose in Denmark and other places in the world. Sort of, what does free speech mean? Suddenly some of those who would normally have seen themselves as defenders of free speech said, oh, but free speech can't be used to punch down on vulnerable minorities, and it has to be used in a responsible manner. And essentially arguing for blasphemy codes that should be respected in the West, at least when it came to certain groups. And on the right, people were sort of free speech absolutists. But then I saw sort of these positions change. So later on, right-wing government came into power, and suddenly a number of laws were adopted that were everyone knew, even if they were formally neutral, everyone understood they were aimed at sort of Muslim extremists, but so curtailing religious speech. And then suddenly, people on the left who would be worried about the cartoon said, oh, this is a terrible violation of free speech, while people on the right were saying, well, free speech is important, but if we allow this kind of speech, it will undermine democracy and speech as such. And I saw these sort of tribalist positions on free speech, and people sort of rejecting principle and using sometimes free speech as sort of an ideological prop, almost, to bolster underlying positions. So I was interested in if, how, and why free speech is so important, because we all claim, most of us claim that it's important, but often we're also willing to compromise.
Right. There are limits.
Right.
There are limits. Like in the US, you can't have a discussion before someone says, oh, you can't shout fire in a crowded theater. And,
that's a favorite. But I even texted Vanessa last night, make sure that we get to fire, because that's a sticking point for me. It's a journey that I feel a lot of us have underwent. You have those two familiar stages. First, your encounter with the fragility of free speech. A lot of people had that with Salman Rushdie affair. Everybody encounters the first excuse that authority uses to limit free speech and remembers that as an important moment. And then the next step is encountering free speech hypocrisy. That the people that you thought were of the same mind in terms of the importance of preserving free speech revealed that they actually have limitations just on the other side or on other issues.
Exactly. Yeah. It's what I in the book call Milton's curse. After the English author John Milton, who wrote sort of a much celebrated defense of press freedom, Areopagitica, in 1644. But when you read it more closely, it turns out that censorship is fine if it's aimed at Catholics and atheists and people with immoral ideas. And really, press freedom for Milton is mostly just various Reformed Protestant mainline sects.
Just curious, historically, who was the first thinker to advocate for kind of a radical free speech in the way that I guess we conceptualize as
wait. I feel like that's a spoiler.
Okay, we're going to come back to that question.
Yes.
All right. I actually time to think.
Because I want to start definitely way before radical free speech, or maybe not before, but I want to set the stage properly with this. So we're going to get to Vanessa's questions, and we're going to get to discussion of the current state of free speech. But we have very different ideas of what constitutes free speech. And you start by trying to answer at least two or three big questions. Whose speech? What is encompassed by that freedom? And who protects that speech? Or what protections are we looking for? In your book, you start by talking about the Athenian democracy and the difference between tell me if I'm pronouncing it incorrectly, Parousia and Isagoria.
Yeah.
My background is in Latin, not in ancient Greek, so I.
No, I'm sadly I don't read or speak Greek, and certainly not ancient Greek either. But I think obviously there's a lot of things about ancient history we don't know, so maybe we're doing injustice to some civilization somewhere in the world that had an elaborate concept of free speech that we just are not aware of. But as far as I can tell, the concept of free speech originated, in the Athenian democracy some 2,500 years ago. And as you rightly mentioned, two overlapping concepts of free speech. So one was isagoria, which means equality of speech, which is basically political speech. So it's the right of freeborn male citizens to discuss and vote on laws at the assembly. So as part of the direct Athenian democracy, which really set it apart, because even the poor had a direct vote. So it was not a rule by the wealthiest or the wise necessarily. And then the broader concept of parousia, meaning something like uninhibited speech, which was perhaps something like a cultural trait of the Athenian democracy. So that's when you went down to the agora, the marketplace, and you get roasted by Socrates, or you were a philosopher and you set up an academy where you're allowed to philosophize, even if your doctrines are very critical of Athenian democracy. And so the Athenians are sort of proud of their democracy and the equality of speech. They argue. So Herodotus, the grandfather of history, says that before the Athenians developed equality of speech, they were unremarkable, but then they found the strength to beat back the Persians. And of course, there's a fair bit of propaganda in this, but nonetheless, and you have the famous funeral oration by Pericles, where he also extols the virtues of Athenian democracy, including the fact that they deliberate political action before they rush into it. And that was certainly the ideal. It didn't always work out so well for them. And you have someone like Demosthenes who says that basically, here in Athens, you can criticize our constitution and government, and you can praise our bitter enemies in Sparta. But if you go to Sparta, you can only praise the Spartan constitution, and you can't say anything nice about Athens. And I think that's really still the litmus test of free speech, right? That you're able to criticize the government and system under which you live. So I think that sort of sums up the Athenian. Of course, there are all kinds of, it was not absolutist free speech. Also, there was this problem that they didn't have sort of constitutional individual freedoms. So as Socrates found out, if you were dragged before a jury court, they could vote the way they wanted. It was not an independent judiciary upholding constitutional rights. And that's why a lot of people saw it as a sort of mob rule that people wanted to avoid.
In fact, it already brings into light the tension that we're talking about in the question of who protects these rights, because those qualities were a matter of norms or of cultural predilections more than any legally protected and enforced regulations, which sometimes leads to weird and contradictory results. For instance, with the case of Socrates, I mean, the excuses for executing Socrates was corruption of youth and atheism or blasphemy or something along those lines, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
But underlying that as well was the fragility of the Athenian democracy at that particular point in time, at the heels of the Peloponnesian, I can never pronounce that word.
Peloponnesian War, yes.
Peloponnesian War, yes. Yeah. God damn the Greeks. But that created an interesting paradox within Athenian democracy, where on one hand, the democratic qualities, the legacy of Pericles that they were trying to preserve, included that kind of lavish, uninhibited speech. But on the other hand, they couldn't afford actually the dissent that might undermine democracy or undermine the structures that unite the demos. So already that moment has that paradox, right?
Yes, yeah. You could argue that the Athenians became militant Democrats before the concept of militant democracy. In that Socrates himself, of course, Socrates was not a fan of democracy, and even though he was a prolific practitioner of parousia, I'm not sure he saw it as as the greatest value when it came to sort of the uneducated. But he had very close relationships to some of these oligarchic types who overthrew the Athenian democracy, and so the Athenians no longer saw him as someone who enriched their culture and democracy. They saw him as a national security threat, and also, it was not a secular state. So even though it was pretty tolerant by by later standards, there were limits to what you could do and say about religion. And so when Socrates sort of was thought to introduce new divinities, then in that specific national security context, that was seen as a threat. Since the gods might punish him. And of course, scholars still continue, what were the precise specific reasons why he was executed. Was it political? Was it religious? Was it a mix?
We don't really have a lot of unbiased accounts of that.
We don't have a lot of unbiased accounts, and sadly, the live recordings have been lost in the archives.
Lost the C-SPAN feed.
Yeah.
You mentioned militant democracy, though, even though that's jumping a few millennia ahead. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so and maybe we'll get to it later. So this may be one of the hopefully more provocative chapters of the book. So in Europe, where one of the main reasons for limiting free speech, even in democracies, is the ethos of never again, which of course I very strongly believe in. But and that argues that in order to avoid the horrors of the Second World War, and of course, especially the Holocaust, the demonization of a minority, ultimately ending up in the industrial scale genocide, sort of means that democracies have to limit the most hateful, anti-democratic sentiments. And it was something that was suggested already in 1937 by a German immigrant professor called Karl Löwenstein, who went to Columbia and wrote these very influential articles where he said that European democracies had gravely sinned by being too tolerant of fascist movements and had to be much more intolerant of intolerance, as Karl Popper later said. And I argue that I don't think the history of the Weimar Republic and the rise of the Third Reich bears out that argument. Though I will say that I don't try to explain the demise of the Weimar Republic and the rise of the Third Reich through the narrow lens of censorship and free speech. I think that would... In
fact, if I remember correctly, you say something along the lines is not only is that not the only cause, it's probably one of the least important causes.
Yeah, no, there was a little incident called like World War One. There was a Russian Revolution. There was a crack on Wall Street. There was a lack of democratic history and strong institutions. So those were...
Tradition. Yeah. This obviously connects to current events in at least in the way that we're thinking about where the limits of free speech should or shouldn't be drawn. Now we have this giant gap of 2,000 years of what we broadly call Western history. Can you take us just through what you see as the key points? And maybe in that process, we can touch what Vanessa is asking about, the earliest articulation or articulations of radical free speech. I definitely just want to make sure that we go through the Dark Ages and the Muslim world, because that's a chapter about free speech that I don't often encounter.
Yeah, so I think it's important, to contrast Athenian free speech with the Roman free speech. And Adaam, this is maybe where you're more of an expert. Since
I'm all about libertas.
So if you read Tacitus, and you'll see lots of references to free speech, but generally, in the Roman Republic, free speech is more for the elite. So it's top down rather than bottom up. As opposed to Athenian assemblies, ordinary citizens don't have a right to speak, and it'll be sort of the senatorial elite, maybe like Cicero and Cato and those guys who exercise free speech. And Cicero is very clear that he says, "Oh, I love Greek culture and philosophy, but the very reason why Greece founded was because of egalitarian democracy of the mob. They elected all
those wanton babbling,
exactly the unwashed, ill-educated mob that you gave the right to decide the matters of state, even though they were completely uneducated, and everything went to hell." didn't go so well for Cicero and and his generation either. You could say, even though they wanted to preserve the republic, didn't really play out that well. But that was the theory, and I think
it's interesting for Cicero, at least the way that history tells that story, and obviously it has a lot of retroactive embellishments. But it was probably his finest free speech moment of actually doing something that was in what we might call seditious or subversive.
And there's lots of things that he writes also sort of under the rule of Caesar. He does favor free speech, but he favors sort of a more of an elitist free speech conception, and we will see, that become the tension between egalitarian and elitist free speech. I find is a recurrent phenomenon throughout the history of free speech. And maybe in particular right now in the age of the internet and social media. So what we typically will see is that whenever there's a technological or political development that broadens the public sphere to previously muted groups, whether it's the poor and property-less, women, racial, religious minorities, the elites, the institutional gatekeepers who have a privileged access to shape the public sphere, have this existential dread of what will happen when the unwashed mob is given access to the public sphere, and we see that again and again, I think, throughout history. And I think the elitist conception of free speech is initially has the strongest pull on early Enlightenment thinkers, so they look more to Rome than to Greece. But when it comes to the Middle Ages, as you rightly said. The Abbasid Caliphate and the sort of adjacent lands is an interesting case because it's a very fertile intellectual environment. So you have some of the most radical free thinkers of the medieval era, people like Razi, this Persian polymath, who essentially
and just for listeners who are not necessarily familiar, the Abbasid Empire is the most expansive Muslim caliphate, I think, in history at the golden age of Islam, and was from around the 8th century to the 14th, I think.
Yeah, and at certain times they don't really have established control in all their lands, and I think that's part of the reasons why it's fertile ground, because centralized command and control of information tends to inhibit free speech. But the caliphs essentially translate almost all secular Greek works of philosophy and science, and also advocate sort of an understanding of Islam which leaves more scope for using pagan philosophy, including Aristotle, and so that puts less emphasis, I think, on harsh religious orthodoxy. And you have all these great thinkers and philosophers who will inspire events later on in the Western world. And as I said, some of the most radical free thinkers who emphasize, the role of reason as the ultimate arbiter of things rather than religious orthodoxy, who reject prophecy, who reject the divine authority of holy books and stuff like so. Pretty radical. These are like tiny minorities. It's not like a movement, but they are sort of radical ideas that we can pick up from the scraps and pieces that have survived.
So there were a small group of radical thinkers within this caliphate, and they weren't rejected. They weren't tortured. Like that. What were the consequences?
They were certainly rejected. So for one of them, we only have really his furious opponents' descriptions of what he of what he said and wrote, which means we can't be sure of. But it certainly seems like he was a radical, and there are different accounts. One of them says that he had to flee persecution, and he was certainly sort of hounded, but not executed or imprisoned. But the fact that their writings on these things don't survive might suggest that later generations were not great fans.
I love how much of the history of our historical quote-unquote heroes is told through the lens of their enemies.
Right.
I mentioned it before in the podcast, but one of my favorite Bertrand Russell quotes is, if there's one thing that can make me appreciate Plato, it's Aristotle's attacks against him.
it's a bit of a frustrating exercise, often sort of trying to piece together these things, and sort of when you have like a money quote, seen from our perspective, it's like, wow, this is great stuff. Well, while at the time it might have been sort of embellished by an opponent to make him look
Right.
as bad as possible.
Right. He wasn't as nearly as radical
Right.
as his opponents made him, and that, wow, he was so ahead of his time.
Yeah, exactly.
And that actually happens a lot over sexuality in history, doesn't it? Because often people try to depict their enemies as more licentious and depraved than they are. And then you go back and read it 1,000 years later, and you're like, oh, wow, they were so sexually progressive.
Yeah, exactly. But just to round off the medieval times, then, I think in Western Europe, there are sort of two developments that pulls in different directions. So you have, the establishment of universities where pagan philosophy is gradually advances. There's a lot of pushback initially, but but ultimately becomes orthodoxy, and I think that has huge consequences for how for the knowledge and dissemination of philosophy and science in later centuries in Europe. But of course, at the same time, you also have the medieval Inquisition, which which very much pulls things in the other direction, which sort of tries to establish a religious orthodoxy that can ultimately end up with people being burned, imprisoned, and tortured. Even though the numbers of people who were executed were not as dramatic as once believed, I think we can be pretty certain that if you lived in a village somewhere in Germany and France, and suddenly the Inquisition come along, and you have a lot of people being put up on a scaffold and being shamed in front of people, and some of them are burned, that will have a certain effect on your willingness to question religious beliefs, and will have an effect in terms of self-censorship.
And I imagine that the university scholars weren't the ones
No,
being
exactly.
pulled up onto the scaffold.
And there were actually relatively quite few cases being brought, sort of legal cases being brought against academics. And I think this may have something to do, again, with this elitist egalitarian conception. So the church might grudgingly accept that you have a small, tiny elite of well-educated scholars who speak Greek and Latin and sort of push the boundaries of orthodoxy. But it's a very different thing to have ordinary people question the authority of the church and religious orthodoxy. So that's something that you want to avoid at all costs, sort of a popular spread of heterodox ideas.
Let's fast forward. Obviously, we have the Reformation and the printing press. Nobody really needs any reminder how revolutionary the printing press was. Yeah.
Well, getting to what Jakob was saying too, it's like whenever there's a technological movement that it broadens the scope, that was one of the biggest.
Yeah.
Right.
And with that,
and even today, every time we have these conversations, and it happened so many times, happened with Martin Curry.
He's great. I love his book.
He's phenomenal.
Yeah, great.
Happened with Matt Welch too.
Yep.
Every time that we talk about the throes of debate on social media, they basically say, deal with it. This is what happens when you have technological changes. A debate that is ongoing. But yeah, so to take us through what happens after the print revolution, and not to nudge you in any direction, but also tell us why Spinoza was the most important person for radical free speech.
Yeah, well, yeah, the printing press and Martin Luther is obviously a very explosive cocktail, because he uses it basically to invent the art of religious populism, writing in German, writing short, punchy pamphlets, using cartoons as memes, appealing to the masses, translating the New Testament into German, and insisting that children be taught how to read. But then, lo and behold, people who start reading don't necessarily have the same interpretation of Christianity as Martin Luther. And so Martin Luther, along with other reformers, actually become as censorious and persecutorial as the Catholic Church. But I think, out of that religious turmoil grows a grudging acceptance of of religious tolerance, basically. But interestingly, the first sort of places of religious tolerance and religious freedom, even on an individual level, we find in Central and Eastern Europe. So you find that in Transylvania, you find that in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, where even anti-Trinitarians, who were like seen as some of the worst, they had a right to practice their faith. But the Dutch Republic, fast forwarding towards approaching Spinoza, the northern Dutch provinces threw off Spanish Habsburg rule, and then religious freedom or freedom of conscience became sort of a constitutional um, element, even though Catholics were not protected, and religious tolerance was so. But it basically created this decentralized entity with very weak central political authority. So the provinces could have their own rules, and that was a relatively cosmopolitan atmosphere, culture in cities like Amsterdam. There was a lot of emphasis on commercialism, including printing books, which Dutch printers and publishers could then sell in European states with a lot stricter censorship. And so a culture, if you like, of free speech developed, and the Dutch Republic became the printing house of Europe. So printed many more books. These weekly newspapers emerged, and people from different faiths were living together, which made it much more difficult to impose religious authority, even though the Reformed Church tried. And so you could have someone like Spinoza come along, who first got excommunicated by by the Jewish community, and then wrote his anonymous theological political treatise in 1670, which argues that free speech is a natural right and essential in a state, and to limit it is tyrannical. And so I think Spinoza's defense of free speech is really important. Even though if you go to England, you have the Levelers in the 1640s, who I think might be the most radical of the 17th century when it comes to sort of, and in many ways are sort of the early modern proponents of egalitarian, free and equal speech with unacknowledged roots in the Athenian model, even if they were in favor of representative rather than direct democracy. A much more radical defense of free speech than John Milton, who's their contemporary, who, as I alluded to in the beginning, did not advocate the free speech for Catholics, and who was in favor of harsh blasphemy laws, and who ended up serving as a censor under Cromwell.
Wow.
So I've often sort of regretted that the history of the Levelers seems to have been forgotten. We talk about John Milton, we lionize him today, but no one talks about William Warren or Richard Overton, John Lilburn. They are sort of known only by specialist scholars. So I think they may be sort of the earliest really radical proponents of democracy in the early modern era, but they quickly fade away. But if you look at what they argue, you can, in many ways, it's an early idea of what would later be enshrined in the First Amendment and the U.S. Constitution, the ideas of the Levelers. If you look at Madison, for instance, I don't think he specifically references the Levelers, but the ideas in many ways are very similar.
We can't really talk about how free speech was treated or even conceived of during those periods or these different groups without understanding the context of the things that they were struggling against, the sort of censorship that they saw as most pernicious. Like, you get the rhetoric of the American Revolution very much derived from the British Civil War, but now we're looking at it as a universalizable concept, even though it's very hard to really square whether or not, when you read the Declaration about inalienable rights that seem to speak of universal concepts, put aside the obvious hypocrisies of slavery and all the incongruities, because even without slavery, it's difficult to imagine that they really were trying to pen down the universal truth of humanity as opposed to respond to their political plight.
Yeah, or that there might be differences between them in to which degree they thought of these freedoms as truly universal. I think someone like if you go to France, someone like Condorcet, for instance, seems to me to be someone who really believes in universal freedom. So he's an early uh, he's probably the most radical French philosopher in terms of his defense of free speech, but he's also against slavery. He's in favor of the equality of the sexes. He doesn't believe in punishing homosexuality, and believes in this full civil rights for Jews, and so on. So in that sense, I think there are some who are sort of truly radical, whereas others are less so. And of course, among founders and framers, you also have the split between the elitist and the egalitarian free speech conception that you see break out in 1798 with the Sedition Act. 7 years after the First Amendment has been ratified in 1791, you suddenly have your Hamiltons, your Adams, and your Washingtons who believe that the press has gone too far, and you have your Madison and your Jeffersons who see the Sedition Act as a total repudiation of the First Amendment and the ideals that it's supposed to embody.
But even there, pointedly, partly it's because Madison and Jefferson are on the losing side of persecution.
Well, yeah. Even Jefferson is someone who's liable to become afflicted by Milton's curse. So but he gives a great speech. He wins the 1800 election. His first inaugural address is in 1801 when he assumes the presidency, and he gives this great speech where he says, we should settle our differences through debate and not using the law. And he doesn't revive the Sedition Act, but in 1803 he gets so tired of being dragged through the mud in the Federalist press that he sort of writes these private letters that maybe it would be a good idea with a few prosecutions under under state law. So in that sense, he too compromised, and even I think someone like Tom Paine would definitely be someone who saw Enlightenment values as universal. But even he, when he was in France, there's a moment where he says, we have to clamp down on calumny because calumny is eroding all authority, and he can see the sort of the terror spinning out of control, and of course he very nearly is beheaded himself.
So that goes to the big question, one of the big questions, that free speech this is something that even its most ardent advocates really can't stomach.
Under pressure, right?
Right.
When there's the illusion of stability, then it's all great to be an advocate. But as soon as there's a sense of vulnerability, that's when it's really hard to stick to your guns.
Vulnerability, or when you're on the sharp
on the losing end. Yeah.
I think when we sense that we're under threat and the ideas and values of the society that we live in are being threatened by movements or individuals and their ideas, is when we tend to sort of revert to our human default mode of evolved intolerance, whereas tolerance and free speech are something that we've had to build on top of
cultivate.
Yeah, exactly. So you certainly see that again and again, and I think human beings are extremely skilled at developing elaborate arguments as to why, on this specific subject, free speech should not apply. And our confirmation bias allows us to construct these elaborate arguments, legal, philosophical, of why allowing this kind of speech would really undermine free speech as such, and we can say it and believe it, even though if someone we disagreed with used the same arguments for their position, we would vehemently disagree.
Well, and I mean, despite all of the pressures that have been put on free speech throughout different moments of American history, I would imagine that you would argue, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I would imagine that you'd argue that American example is one of the more successful examples of a country that has supposedly embraced free speech. And I'm wondering if you agree with that. Where do you derive that success? Is it because of the laws that were written at the very beginning, at the founding? Is it because of the culture that has kind of pushed for it? Is it the intersection of the two? Where do you locate that success?
Yeah, no, I think when you look at the law, the interpretation of the First Amendment, you really have to get to the 1950s before it sort of really consistently applied to a very high and culminating maybe in 1969 with Brandenburg versus Ohio, that really sets the bar extremely high and sort of enshrines American free speech exceptionalism. But nonetheless, it's true that you had the Sedition Act, but that prior to that you've had the terror in France and then Napoleon's sort of authoritarianism coming after that, and all around Europe, the French Revolution sets in motion forces of reaction that and at the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1814, 1815, basically Europe reverts to the dedication of throne and altar, and free speech should be kept under lock and key, and that's not true to the same extent at all in the U.S. Though the big exception, of course, being the antebellum South, where you have, especially in the 1830s, very very draconian laws prohibiting abolitionist ideas, even prescribing the death penalty. But if we can set aside from that, I don't know if that's possible, but I would say that in 1735, there's a big the Sanger case. So you basically have this public official in New York who sets up his own newspaper, use it as a propaganda tool, and then his opponents set up a rival newspaper where they relentlessly attack him, and then he tries to bring these seditious libel suits against them. Can't persuade a grand jury, but then he goes after the publisher, and then the publisher loses the case, even though the law is completely on the side of this politician. The jury just refuses to convict him, and that really becomes a moment where Americans are no longer willing to convict their co-citizens as for seditious libel for criticizing their governors, and that is born, I think, out of a culture of free speech where Americans, using pamphlets, speaking in taverns, and so on, and also just with different, moving across the lines of colonies with different jurisdictions allows for a culture of free speech that is more permissive than in Europe. So even though the First Amendment does not provide strong legal protection for much of its history, there's a wider degree of commitment to a culture of free speech than in Europe.
Just to be clear about the details, the New York state laws allowed for harsher libel prosecution against a publisher, and basically the jury was essentially a hung jury. They decided
no, well, basically it's like a scene out of a movie. Basically, you can't really criticize politicians because that is seen as seditious libel, and especially if you mock them, poke fun of them, and accuse them of unflattering things. And so the law is basically on the side, and truth is not a defense. So even if what you're saying is true, truth is not a defense. But then this very experienced trial lawyer comes up. Imagine this is a movie. The judge is very much in the favor of this politician, and then at the last moment you have this experienced trial lawyer goes up and gives this great speech, rousing everyone in the courtroom, and then the jury just returns and says, we're not going to convict. We're not going to convict you. This is the free speech is the bulwark of liberty, and then there's a cheer outside the courtroom, and so it creates this momentum for free speech and political free speech, robust political free speech. And you also see Americans, using symbolic free speech to further political ideas. So that creates a more robust culture of free speech, something that would never be allowed in old regime France, for instance, where you'd probably be executed or spent several years in the Bastille if you did similar things.
So this is really meaningful to me because a conversation that I find myself having a lot is that the culture versus law importance of free speech, or the
Right.
prima facie legal protections of free speech compared to how important cultural is. I've been accused by members of this household that I put too much emphasis on cultural history and cultural political thinking. And my position is that a lot of those notions of liberty really are nothing more than how the culture interprets them. And in contrast, a different argument that we find ourselves sometimes having is the question of critical race theory is something that we talk often in this podcast because I've studied critical legal theory as an Israeli student intrigued by American legal quiddities. Some of the ideas there are incredibly important and revealing when you're trying to apply some of the stuff that we've done in this conversation, like understanding that ideas that even sound universal aren't really universal and that come from a very rooted in an historical context, and sometimes the hypocrisies and corruption is embedded in the lofty language. But, and this is where I draw my line in that conversation, the fact that those hypocrisies and evils may have existed doesn't mean that the way that we have then absorbed those lofty ideas into our culture isn't worth protecting. And that's why I put so much emphasis on culture, because ultimately the things that we care about, like free expression and open democratic civil society, depend on how we interpret our own stories, how we interpret those ideals. And that mindset can just change rather quickly to more parochial, tribal, violent tendencies.
To draw an analogy, if you say, free speech is worthless because the First Amendment was drafted by white slave owners who cared nothing for the rights of their slaves, then that's true. But democracy was also excluded women and the poor and the propertyless. So are you going to say democracy is not worth defending because those who first gave voice to it had a much more limited ideal of what democracy is, or because the Greeks only allowed freeborn male citizens and not slaves and women and foreigners to participate? And I think what is important here are the principles. When you expand those principles and include more and more groups that were previously excluded, do things get better or worse?
Mhm.
I tend to think that when it comes to free speech, things get better. And I certainly have not seen any society with values or institutions that I would like to live under that do not have a critical component of free speech protection and adherence at a cultural level.
It's also kind of like this is why free speech matters, right? All of the historical examples that you give, all I think almost exclusively they're all saying that the the quality of life for all, including minorities and the oppressed, is almost always better, if not unequivocally always better, when there is expansive freedom of speech. I don't think you give any historical example, or am I wrong?
No. Conversely, I would say that's more importantly, conversely, and that again, this is your case to make. But whenever you do have restrictions, it's
going to get worse.
It's not the powerful who are going to suffer the cost
Right.
of restrictions.
No, of course, if you have free speech restrictions, they will always be defined and enforced by the powerful. that is almost that's
it's intrinsically
logic.
True.
and of course, if you're Chinese, maybe you will argue that life is better without free speech because of the wealth and stability that has been created compared to earlier. You can certainly make that argument, but then my values are ones that are incompatible with with living under a regime like in China, I would very much like to be able to criticize my government and speak my mind. So of course there's a bit of subjectivity in it there, but I would argue that if you look at American attitudes towards interracial marriage and same-sex marriage, for instance, you see incredible degrees of increase in intolerance. So I think the Gallup poll of 2021 was 94% acceptance of interracial marriages compared to 4% in 1958. When it comes to same-sex marriages, in 2021, it was like 70% of Americans. That's not much compared to where I'm from, but we'll give you some time to catch up. But it's certainly a lot more than just going back to 2010. And those that social progress was not achieved through censoring people who were racial bigots or homophobes. Not a single person, I think, has been censored or sent to prison for expressing hostility towards the LGBT community or blacks in that period. On the contrary, free speech protection under the First Amendment has been increased during that period, and that to me suggests very heavily that the First Amendment values are critical in fostering tolerance. Why are more people acceptant of interracial marriage? Well, that's because civil rights movement used the free speech, won some pretty important victories, but also used it to petition, to demonstrate unequivocally, the injustice of Jim Crow, to have newspapers come and see, peaceful civil rights activists being attacked by dogs, being hosed down, being arrested for holding up a sign saying "one man, one vote." And the gay rights movement arguing eloquently for equality under the law that became very difficult to rebut. And so I think in that sense, free speech has played an incredibly progressive role. I was in Washington, D.C., I think last week. And so I stayed at a hotel near Lafayette Square, just in front of the White House. And so if you go back to 1917, American suffragettes were protesting there, and I think they burned an effigy of President Woodrow Wilson because they demanded the right to vote. So fast forward 100 years, I'm living on the Upper West Side. I take my son to a museum, and when we exit, there are tens of thousands of protesters, most of them women, wearing pink pussy hats and shouting profanities at President Donald Trump. And none of them are arrested. In fact, the NYPD are there to protect their First Amendment freedom. So to me, that's a very powerful demonstration of how free speech has, in practice, not only in principle, been maybe the most powerful engine of human equality that we have ever stumbled upon.
And how do you characterize our current state of free speech culture? Because that was a very rousing thinking of our through line of American culture, but we're also at a moment where it feels more fragile, and maybe even more so in Europe. So how do you diagnose our current status in terms of free speech?
Yeah, I think on one hand, we're living in a golden age of free speech. It's a constitutional protected freedom. It's an international human rights norm. You're sitting in an apartment in Brooklyn, I'm guessing.
Queens.
Okay. And
we're not cool enough for Brooklyn.
Yeah.
And I'm sitting in Denmark, and we can have an uncensored conversation in real time. That's unimaginable to previous generation. But at the same time, I would say that we're living through a free speech recession, where both the culture of free speech, specifically maybe in the US, but also the legal protections of free speech, and that would be especially in Europe, are being undermined by liberal democracies. It's not surprising to me that the resurgence of authoritarian states is fueled by censorship and repression, because that's the 101 in the authoritarian's handbook, right? The first victim of authoritarians is free speech. Go back the Athenian democracy, and that's how the oligarch got into power. But I think there's this idea that is gaining ground that free speech entrenches unequal power relations, is a threat to minorities, is a threat to just like truth and democracy as such, and therefore, um, um, you know, elites in among politicians and even in the media who would previously have very strong free speech instincts have become more apprehensive about the idea of free speech, and maybe that it has gone too far and something needs to be done to impose some sort of semblance and top-down control of an unruly public sphere. And I think, they're right in that, that's what Martin Gurri describes in his book, that, we are living in a fragmented era where trust in institutions have dropped. And so it seems like we're living through chaos, and when the
disruption is real.
The disruption is real, and the harms and costs of free speech have been amplified. And I think also as human beings, a lot of the harms and costs of free speech we wouldn't necessarily see before, because there would be editors and journalists who would not allow certain kinds of speech into the public sphere. Now it's there for everyone to see. And also as human beings, I think we tend to take in democracies, we tend to take free speech, all the benefits for granted. So we don't, when we're having this conversation now, we're not thinking of it as exercising our right to free speech. We're just talking. We're doing a podcast interview. It's what we do every day. But if you're in Russia or in Iran or Turkey, there could be severe consequences for doing what we do now. And at the same time, I think we also have this negativity bias. So we tend to focus myopically almost on the threats or perceived threats and harms and costs of free speech. And unfortunately, when we do that, the cure tends to be worse than the disease when it comes to laws and regulations.
It's also some complacency, like you said, I think, right? Because you would take so much of this free speech infrastructure for granted, and we just assume that, if we only make those minor tweaks in what's permissible, then we get to keep all the good stuff that we got from it, but we'll just rid ourselves of those little tumors.
Yeah, exactly. Good example. So yesterday, the European Commission said that they want to ban Russian propaganda media outlets.
RT, yeah, we were going to ask you about that.
And everyone says yes, of course, because we're all affected by what we're seeing. We want to help the Ukrainian people, and I'm all in favor of really harsh sanctions. But I think this specific one is a really, really bad idea. First, do you really want the European Commission to define what is propaganda, truth, and lies for 27 democracies? Is that a precedent that you're comfortable with? It's certainly not a precedent that I would be comfortable with once it's introduced. But also, what does it suggest? It suggests that people in democracies are so gullible that they will fall for Russian disinformation and propaganda. And what we're seeing is the opposite. The Ukrainian perspective has completely won over at least the platforms of Twitter and Facebook and YouTube. Everyone has the Ukrainian flag, and the narrative is very much pro-Ukrainian. And I think the Russian disinformation and propaganda just looks so weak and pathetic. And of course, what will happen is that if the commission does it, it will provide talking points not only to Putin, where he says, "Oh yeah, they're saying they're fighting for democracy, but look, they're censoring us." But it will also provide talking points and whataboutery points to sort of Putinists, apologists on the right and left in Western countries who will say, "Oh yeah, you're fighting for democracy, but you're no better than the Russians because you're using censorship." So and of course, the Russians will respond by kicking out BBC and Deutsche Welle and others. And, the benefits in democracies of shutting down RT are zero, but the loss of having these small islands of critical journalism in Russia at this moment are huge. So I think it's really, really a harebrained idea, even if I understand what motivates it.
Right, and this is to the whole point I came in thinking about after reading your book, and it's something that's on my mind. The different tendencies that different groups try to censor, where the right tends to focus on things like depravity, impiety. The left usually goes to things like incitement or hate, and sometimes ideological impurity. But in the case of RT, there seems to be like a nice, easy villain for everybody to target, and they are a villain. But the idea that banning them would matter is exactly where you find that beautiful bipartisan consensus of how to solve problems in the wrong way. And ironically, at a time, as you point out, that we see that I don't remember whose quote it is, the idea that propaganda can heighten the passions of the public, but it can't create them.
Yeah, so it's Aldous Huxley, this quote from
Huxley, right.
1936.
And we see the same playing out right now with, for instance, Tucker Carlson. Tucker Carlson is another target. People constantly want to encourage ad boycotts, thinking that somehow if they tweet enough about it, Fox is going to fire him.
Or even like cancel culture more generally, right? Like how many people get quote unquote canceled and then their ratings go through the roof.
Right. That's for sure. That's a Streisand effect, right? But with Tucker Carlson, they try to push him out. And what happened now, like with the latest thing they would try to attack him on, totally justifiably because his speech was repugnant, was has Putin ever done cancel culture to you? It was absolutely insane. But now, 4 or 5 days later, he's completely backtracking and saying Putin is a villain. So he realizes his own position was untenable. He didn't need to be canceled to see that everybody who was really into the pro-Putin appeasement has now changed because propaganda doesn't create those feelings; it exploits them.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And also, if you wanted to crack down on RT and Russian disinformation, what about the Western-based pundits and others who basically say the same things? Do you also want to go after them?
Right.
I've been looking at almost
Glenn Greenwald.
Like Glenn Greenwald's account. I think sometimes he's had some good points, but I'm just like, I think when I look at his tweets throughout this conflict, it's one of the most depressing, amoral things. Sort of like looking at through a completely blinkered U.S.-centric lens of I hate Democrats and traditional media, and therefore I'm going to reflexively oppose all their takes, like, because they were hypocritical about the Iraq war, sort of ignoring that a number of European countries and millions of people in those countries, like take France and Germany, not only opposed the Iraq war, but are also against Putin's invasion of Ukraine. So that to me is incredible. But I would defend Glenn Greenwald's right to incredibly bad takes any day of the week. But if you really wanted to take away Russian propaganda talking point, then arguably you'd have to go after him as well, and Tucker Carlson and Steve Bannon and lots of others, both people on the left and the right, because this Ukraine conflict, confirms sort of the horseshoe theory, where you have sort of people on the left and the right who unite in their hatred or dislike of liberal democracy. And I agree with your take, and I think it's sad to that at this, of course, we don't know what the outcome of Ukraine crisis will be, but I think right now we're seeing a recommitment to liberal democratic ideals that have sort of been away for a long time, and which arguably is one of the reasons why liberal democracy is in crisis, because we don't feel, that's also one of the problems with free speech, right? It's not when you're under attack, when you're living in a dictatorship, free speech is something that motivates you, that creates social cohesion. But once you've won it, once you've lived with free speech, it doesn't bind you in the same way that nationalism or religion does. And so, you can think of it as, why is it so important? It's just a principle that my ideological enemies get to spread their propaganda.
It was a story that I keep coming back to in my head. I remember doing some reporting 2 years ago about internet shutdowns and the way that different countries approach this. But one of the depressing trends that you saw that you could get an alliance between supposed liberal and liberals countries around the world around those. If we just create a clear enough terminology to what we all agree should be censored, then we can move forward with that. And there was a UN statement, I think, that countries were working on. I don't remember if it ended up passing or not. That the Internet Sans Frontières was fighting harshly against, where they were trying to clearly define hate speech. And it seemed, and a lot, all the progressives of Europe were rallying behind it. And obviously, this was statements that were greatly supported by China and Russia. And I always feel like if you find yourself in a place where you get the full endorsement of China and Russia, maybe you're not servicing liberal democracy.
And you see that with Germany. Germany has adopted this law, the Network Enforcement Act, which basically says that tech giants have to remove manifestly illegal content within 24 hours or face huge fines. And funnily enough, that law has been copy-pasted in bad faith by Russia, by Turkey, by Venezuela, by Singapore, all these countries that can then again use sort of whataboutery, even though it's a much more draconian version that they've adopted, and say, well, this is a German law, so why can't we do it if Germany can?
Yeah. So in our last 5 minutes, Jakob, I'd like to ask you these questions about democracy, if you don't mind. So we're going to be having a series of conversations with other folks who think about these questions, and so I just want to get your take on them. They're kind of basic, but fundamental and important, I think. So I'm going to tell you all 3 questions just so you have like the arc in your mind. So it's just what constitutes liberal democracy? What is it? Why does it matter? And what is the most important thing we can do to protect liberal democracy today? So I'll start at the top. What constitutes liberal democracy?
It combines popular sovereignty with respect and dignity and autonomy of the individual, along with the independent institutions and the rule of law. So it's a very delicate ecosystem, which is very difficult, I think, to build and sustain, and of course its history is very brief and short. But to me, it looks like the best system ever invented. So I hope we can keep it.
This is, I think, to me, a very interesting question, because everybody defines or understands the key features of a liberal democracy differently, but how they define it usually pertains to why they find it so important or not important. If you're Viktor Orban, but but still, it really depends on the way you define it. For instance, for me, you were talking about Pericles. I remembered when I was first studying that oration. That to me, it shows how free interaction and free speech aren't just the mechanism to protect democracy; they are the raison d'être of democracy.
Free speech is not only the bulwark of liberty; it is the first freedom of democracy. And so it really doesn't matter, if you're big into privacy or climate change or any sort of other worthy goal. Free speech is really what you want in order to be able to press your case, to rally for action, to make your argument, to persuade your opponents. And also, I think free speech is really, in a democracy, is the antithesis of violence. It basically is a commitment to the idea that we can settle our differences, that we can be pragmatic and compromise through discussing different ideas. So in many ways, I've become much more pragmatic on many issues. The one issue where I'm not pragmatic on is free speech, because I see free speech as the basis for pragmatism and compromise. Because in order to compromise and become pragmatic, you need to have a discussion, and then then we can settle on something where we both can live with it.
And so liberal democracy matters because it is the ecosystem that more successfully preserves the right to free speech.
Yeah, and along with the other reason, but also it gives protection to minorities, but it also allows you to basically not be defined by your whatever, your race or your religion or the like. In that sense, it's also very liberating for the individual person. While at the same time, you can engage in communities with others. So it preserves both individual autonomy, but also allows you to pursue meaning and in groups and in social interactions with others, and that I think is a great genius of liberal democracy. But it doesn't. You have to work hard to find meaning.
It doesn't offer you that meaning. It doesn't
Yeah.
doesn't prescribe that meaning for you.
It's not imposed on you. So that's what makes it difficult. But it allows you, to study, and if you want to be religious, you can be religious. So in that sense, I think that's also one of the great things about liberal democracy.
So today you get two arguments against liberal democracy, one from the right, one from the left. The right says that liberal democracy, liberalism, tears us apart because it doesn't offer us a center of meaning, a focus of ideas and ideology. It creates an atomized society with no mutual connections, with no shared values, with no purpose. Accordingly, we need that philosophical, read religious, conformity and orthodoxy to keep us together, to make us thrive as humans. And from the left, the criticism is that liberal democracy is and always has been a charade, and it's easily hijacked by the powerful to perpetuate inequality. And I think they lob the same criticism at free speech. So how do you respond?
Yeah, no, I think that there are fair points in them, but I think the alternative is worse. And I also, I wouldn't want to live in a society where Sohrab Ahmari determined a meaning or the capital good, capital S society. And I think it is perfectly possible to find that meaning in liberal democracies. But I myself have come to emphasize. We have a state church here in Denmark. We have a monarchy. I think those are great institutions. Actually, I can criticize the monarchy. I don't have to be a member of the state church, but I understand that they provide meaning and social cohesion, and we need that in liberal democracies. But those two institutions have been tamed, if you like, and sort of robbed of their coercive powers. And I think that shows that liberal democracies can be combined with these institutions and rituals that provide meaning to the individual, but just not in a way where it's imposed by fascists or communists or religious totalitarians.
Theocrats.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm. And if you have 10 seconds, is there one thing you'd say is most important for us to protect liberal democracy?
Well, it's going to be a huge surprise, but I I think it'd be a good thing to start getting serious about free speech, and if we manage to safeguard that, I'm confident that we stand on firm ground.
Jakob, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Uncertain Things. Follow us on uncertain.substack.com or wherever you get your podcast. I still owe you more about self-censorship and free speech in general, so stay tuned and give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts if you want to support us. Thank you, and until next time, stay sane. I mean, I sometimes, not always, definitely not always, but I sometimes think that, and then I hear myself, and then I hate myself, and then I want to kill myself. But I think that was okay. Only 26 minutes.
Only.